Story 1, Part 2 of Sea Stories. Narrative of the Mutiny of the Bounty. Sunday, the 24th. A fine morning. I had the pleasure to see produce some cheerful countenances, and for the first time for 15 days past we experienced comfort from the warmth of the sun. We stripped and hung our clothes up to dry, which were by this time become so threadbare that they would not keep out either wet or cold. This afternoon we had many birds about us, which are never seen far from land, such as boobies and noddies. As the sea began to run fair, and we shipped but little water, I took the opportunity to examine into the state of our bread, and found that according to the present mode of issuing, there was a sufficient quantity remaining for 29 days' allowance, by which time I hoped we should be able to reach Timor. But as this was very uncertain, and it was possible that after all we might be obliged to go to Java, I determined to proportion the allowance so as to make our stock hold out 6 weeks. I was apprehensive that this would be ill received, and that it would require my utmost resolution to enforce it, for small as the quantity was which I intended to take away for our future good, yet it might appear to my people like robbing them of life, and some who were less patient than their companions, I expected, would very ill brook it. However, on my representing the necessity of guarding against delays that might be occasioned in our voyage by contrary winds or other causes, and promising to enlarge upon the allowance as we got on, they cheerfully agreed to my proposal. It was accordingly settled that every person should receive 1/25 of a pound of bread for breakfast, and the same quantity for dinner, so that by omitting the proportion for supper we had 43 days' allowance. Monday, the 25th. At noon some noddies came so near to us that one of them was caught by hand. This bird was about the size of a small pigeon. I divided it with its entrails into 18 portions, and by a well-known method at sea of "who shall have this," it was distributed, with the allowance of bread and water for dinner, and ate up, bones and all, with salt water for sauce. I observed the latitude 13 degrees 32 minutes south, longitude made 35 degrees 19 minutes west, course north 89 degrees west, distance 108 miles. In the evening, several boobies flying very near to us, we had the good fortune to catch one of them. This bird is as large as a duck. I directed the bird to be killed for supper, and the blood to be given to 3 of the people who were most distressed for want of food. The body, with the entrails, beak, and feet, I divided into 18 shares, and with an allowance of bread, which I made a merit of granting, we made a good supper, compared with our usual fare. Sailing on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, I at length became satisfied that we were approaching New Holland. This was actually the case, and after passing the reefs which bound that part of the coast, we found ourselves in smooth water. 2 islands lay about 4 miles to the west by north, and appeared eligible for a resting place, if for nothing more. But on our approach to the nearest island, it proved to be only a heap of stones, and its size too inconsiderable to shelter the boat. We therefore proceeded to the next, which was close to it, and toward the main. We landed to examine if there were any signs of the natives being near us. We saw some old fireplaces, but nothing to make me apprehend that this would be an unsafe situation for the night. Every one was anxious to find something to eat, and it was soon discovered that there were oysters on these rocks, for the tide was out. But it was nearly dark, and only a few could be gathered. I determined, therefore, to wait till the morning, when I should know better how to proceed. Friday, the 29th. As there were no appearances to make me imagine that any of the natives were near us, I sent out parties in search of supplies, while others of the people were putting the boat in order. The parties returned, highly rejoiced at having found plenty of oysters and fresh water. I had also made a fire by the help of a small magnifying glass, and what was still more fortunate, we found among a few things which had been thrown into the boat, and saved a piece of brimstone and a tinder box, so that I secured fire for the future. One of the people had been so provident as to bring away with him from the ship a copper pot. By being in possession of this article, we were unable to make a proper use of the supply we now obtained, for, with a mixture of bread and a little pork, we made a stew that might have been relished by people of far more delicate appetites, and of which each person received a full pint. The general complaints of disease among us were a dizziness in the head, great weakness of the joints, and violent tenesmus. The oysters which we found grew so fast to the rocks that it was with difficulty they could be broken off, and at length we discovered to be the most expeditious way to open them where they were fixed. They were of a good size and well tasted. To add to this happy circumstance, in the hollow of the land there grew some wire grass, which indicated a moist situation. On forcing a stick about 3 feet long into the ground, we found water, and with little trouble dug a well, which produced as much as our necessities required. As the day was the anniversary of the restoration of King Charles II, I named the island Restoration Island. Our short stay there, with the supplies which it afforded us, made a visible alteration for the better in our appearance. Next day, Saturday the 30th, at 4 o'clock, we were preparing to embark, when about 20 of the natives appeared, running and hallooing to us on the opposite shore. They were each armed with a spear or lance, and a short weapon which they carried in their left hand. They made signs for us to come to them, but I thought it prudent to make the best of our way. They were naked, and apparently black, and their hair or wool bushy and short. Sunday the 31st. Many small islands were in sight to the northeast. We landed at one of good height, bearing north 1/2 west. The shore was rocky, but the water was smooth, and we landed without difficulty. I sent 2 parties out, one to the northward and the other to the southward, to seek for supplies, and others I ordered to stay by the boat. On this occasion, fatigue and weakness so far got the better of their sense of duty, that some of the people expressed their discontent at having worked harder than their companions, and declared that they would rather be without their dinner than go in search of it. One person in particular went so far as to tell me with a mutinous look that he was as good a man as myself. It was not possible for me to judge where this might have an end, if not stopped in time. Therefore, to prevent such disputes in the future, I determined either to preserve my command or die in the attempt, and seizing a cutlass, I ordered him to take hold of another and defend himself, on which he called out that I was going to kill him, and immediately made concessions. I did not allow this to interfere further with the harmony of the boat's crew, and everything soon became quiet. We here procured some oysters and clams, also some dogfish caught in the holes of the rocks, and a supply of water. Leaving this island, which I named Sunday Island, we continued our course towards Endeavour Straits. During our voyage, Nelson became very ill, but gradually recovered. Next day we landed at another island to see what we could get. There were proofs that this island was occasionally visited by natives from New Holland. Encamping on the shore, I sent out one party to watch for turtle, and another to try to catch birds. About midnight the bird party returned with only 12 noddies, birds which I have already described to be about the size of pigeons. But if it had not been for the folly and obstinacy of one of the party, who separated from the other 2 and disturbed the birds, they might have caught a great number. I was so much provoked at my plans being thus defeated that I gave this offender a good beating. This man afterwards confessed that, wandering away from his companions, he had eaten 9 birds raw. Our turtling party had no success. Tuesday and Wednesday we still kept our course northwest, touching at an island or 2 for oysters and clams. We had now been 6 days on the coast of New Holland, and but for the refreshment which our visit to its shores afforded us, it is all but certain that we must have perished. Now, however, it became clear that we were leaving it behind, and were commencing our adventurous journey through the open sea to Timor. On Wednesday, June 3rd, at 8 o'clock in the evening, we once more launched into the open ocean. Miserable as our situation was in every respect, I was secretly surprised to see that it did not appear to affect anyone so strongly as myself. I encouraged everyone with hopes that 8 or 10 days would bring us to a land of safety, and after praying to God for a continuance of his most gracious protection, I served an allowance of water for supper, and directed our course to the west-southwest to counteract the southerly winds in case they should blow strong. For 6 days our voyage continued, a dreary repetition of those sufferings which we had experienced before reaching New Holland. In the course of the night we were constantly wet with the sea, and exposed to cold and shiverings, and in the daytime we had no addition to our scanty allowance, save a booby and a small dolphin that we caught, the former on Friday the 5th, and the latter on Monday the 8th. Many of us were ill, and the men complained heavily. On Wednesday the 10th, after a very comfortless night, there was a visible alteration for the worse in many of the people, which gave me great apprehensions. An extreme weakness, swelled legs, hollow and ghastly countenances, a more than common inclination to sleep, with an apparent debility of understanding, seemed to me the melancholy presages of an approaching dissolution. Thursday the 11th. Every one received the customary allowance of bread and water, and an extra allowance of water was given to those who were most in need. At noon I observed in latitude 9 degrees 41 minutes south, course south 77 degrees west, distance 109 miles, longitude made 13 degrees 49 minutes west. I had little doubt now of having now passed the meridian of the eastern part of Timor, which is laid down at 128 degrees east. This diffused universal joy and satisfaction. Friday the 12th. At 3 in the morning, with an excess of joy, we discovered Timor bearing from west-southwest to west-northwest, and I hauled on a wind to the north-northeast till daylight, when the land bore from southwest by south to northeast by north, our distance from the shore 2 leagues. It is not possible for me to describe the pleasure which the blessing of the sight of this land diffused among us. It appeared scarcely credible to ourselves that in an open boat, and so poorly provided, we should have been able to reach the coast of Timor in 41 days after leaving Tofoa, having in that time run by our log a distance of 3,618 miles, and that notwithstanding our extreme distress, no one should have perished in the voyage. I have already mentioned that I knew not where the Dutch settlement was situated, but I had a faint idea that it was at the southwest part of the island. I therefore, after daylight, bore away along shore to the south-southwest, which I was the more readily induced to do, as the wind would not suffer us to go towards the northeast without great loss of time. We coasted along the island in the direction in which I conceived the Dutch settlement to lie, and next day, about 2 o'clock, I came to a grapnel in a small sandy bay, where we saw a hut, a dog, and some cattle. Here I learned that the Dutch governor resided at a place called Coupang, which was some distance to the northeast. I made signs for one of the Indians who came to the beach to go in the boat and show us the way to Coupang, intimating that I would pay him for his trouble. The man readily complied and came into the boat. The Indians, who were of a dark tawny color, brought us a few pieces of dried turtle and some ears of Indian corn. This last was the most welcome, for the turtle was so hard that it could not be eaten without being first soaked in hot water. They offered to bring us some other refreshments if I would wait, but as the pilot was willing, I determined to push on. It was about 4:30 when we sailed. Sunday the 14th. At 1 o'clock in the morning, after the most happy and sweet sleep that ever men enjoyed, we weighed and continued to keep the east shore on board in very smooth water. The report of 2 cannon that were fired gave new life to every one, and soon after we discovered 2 square-rigged vessels and a cutter at anchor to the eastward. After hard rowing, we came to a grapnel near daylight, off a small fort and town, which the pilot told me was Coupang. On landing, I was surrounded by many people, Indians and Dutch, with an English sailor among them. A Dutch captain, named Spijkerman, showed me great kindness, and waited on the governor, who was ill, to know at what time I could see him. 11 o'clock having been appointed for the interview, I desired my people to come on shore, which was as much as some of them could do, being scarce able to walk. They, however, were helped to Captain Spikerman's house, and found tea with bread and butter provided for their breakfast. The abilities of a painter perhaps could seldom have been displayed to more advantage than in the delineation of the two groups of figures which at this time presented themselves to each other. An indifferent spectator would have been at a loss which most to admire, the eyes of famine sparkling at immediate relief, or the horror of their preservers at the sight of so many spectres, whose ghastly countenances, if the cause had been unknown, would rather have excited terror than pity. Our bodies were nothing but skin and bone, our limbs were full of sores, and we were clothed in rags. In this condition, with tears of joy and gratitude flowing down our cheeks, the people of Timor beheld us with a mixture of horror, surprise, and pity. The governor, Mr. William Adrian Van Est, notwithstanding extreme ill health, became so anxious about us that I saw him before the appointed time. He received me with great affection, and gave me the fullest proofs that he was possessed of every feeling of a humane and good man, though his infirmity was so great that he could not do the office of a friend himself. He said he would give such orders as I might be certain would procure us every supply we wanted. A house should be immediately prepared for me, and with respect to my people, he said that I might have room for them either at the hospital or on board of Captain Spikerman's ship, which lay in the road. Fate of the mutineers, colony of Pitcairn's Island. The intelligence of the mutiny and the sufferings of Bligh and his companions naturally excited a great sensation in England. Bligh was immediately promoted to the rank of commander, and Captain Edwards was dispatched to Otaheite in the Pandora frigate, with instructions to search for the Bounty and her mutinous crew and bring them to England. The Pandora reached Matavai Bay on the 23rd of March, 1791, and even before she had come to anchor, Joseph Coleman, formerly armourer of the Bounty, pushed off from shore in a canoe and came on board. In the course of 2 days afterwards, the whole of the remainder of the Bounty's crew, in number 16, then on the island, surrendered themselves, with the exception of 2, who fled to the mountains where, as afterwards appeared, they were murdered by the natives. Nearly 20 years elapsed after the period of the above occurrences, and all recollection of the Bounty and her wrecked crew had passed away, when an accidental discovery, as interesting as unexpected, once more recalled public attention to that event. The captain of an American schooner, having in 1808 accidentally touched at an island up to that time supposed to be uninhabited, called Pitcairn's Island, found a community speaking English, who represented themselves as the descendants of the mutineers of the Bounty, of whom there was still one man, of the name of Alexander Smith, alive amongst them. Intelligence of this singular circumstance was sent by the American captain, Folger, to Sir Sidney Smith at Valparaiso, and by him transmitted to the Lords of the Admiralty. But the government was at that time perhaps too much engaged in the events of the Continental War to attend to the information, nor was anything further heard of this interesting little society until 1814. In that year, 2 British men of war, cruising in the Pacific, made Pitcairn's Island, and on nearing the shore saw plantations regularly and orderly laid out. Soon afterwards they observed a few natives coming down a steep descent with their canoes on their shoulders, and in a few minutes perceived one of these little vessels darting through a heavy surf and paddling off towards the ships. But their astonishment may be imagined when, on coming alongside, they were hailed in good English with, "Won't you heave us a rope now?" This being done, a young man sprang up the side with extraordinary activity and stood on the deck before them. In answer to the question, "Who are you?" he replied that his name was Thursday October Christian, son of the late Fletcher Christian by an Otahitian mother, that he was the first born on the island, and was so named because he was born on a Thursday in October. All this sounded singular and incredible in the ears of the British captains, Sir Thomas Staines and Mr. Pippin, but they were soon satisfied of its truth. Young Christian was at this time about 24 years old, a tall, handsome youth, fully 6 feet high, with black hair and an open, interesting English countenance. As he wore no clothes except a piece of cloth around his loins and a straw hat ornamented with black cock's feathers, his fine figure and well-shaped muscular limbs were displayed to great advantage, and attracted general admiration. His body was much tanned by exposure to the weather, but although his complexion was somewhat brown, it wanted that tinge of red peculiar to the natives of the Pacific. He spoke English correctly, both in grammar and pronunciation, and his frank and ingenious deportment excited in everyone the liveliest feelings of compassion and interest. His companion was a fine, handsome youth of 17 or 18 years of age, named George Young, son of one of the Bounty's midshipmen. The youths expressed great surprise at everything they saw, especially a cow, which they supposed to be either a huge goat or a horned sow, having never seen any other quadrupeds. When questioned concerning the Bounty, they referred the captains to an old man on shore, the only surviving Englishman, whose name they said was John Adams, but who proved to be the identical Alexander Smith, before mentioned, having changed his name from some caprice or other. The officers went ashore with the youths, and were received by old Adams, as we shall now call him, who conducted them to his house, and treated them to an elegant repast of eggs, fowl, yams, plantains, breadfruit, etc. They now learned from him an account of the fate of his companions, who, with himself, preferred accompanying Christian in the Bounty to remaining at Otaheite, which account agreed with that he afterwards gave at greater length to Captain Beechey in 1828. Our limits will not permit us to detail all the interesting particulars at length as we could have wished, but they are in substance as follows. It was Christian's object, in order to avoid the vengeance of the British law, to proceed to some unknown and uninhabited island, and the Marquesas Islands were first fixed upon. But Christian, on reading Captain Carteret's account of Pitcairn's Island, thought it better adapted for the purpose, and shaped his course thither. Having landed and traversed it, they found it every way suitable to their wishes, possessing water, wood, a good soil, and some fruits. Having ascertained all this, they returned on board, and having landed their hogs, goats, and poultry, and gutted the ship of everything that could be useful to them, they set fire to her and destroyed every vestige that might lead to the discovery of their retreat. This was on the 23rd of January, 1790. The island was then divided into 9 equal portions among them, a suitable spot of neutral ground being reserved for a village. The poor Otaheitans now found themselves reduced to the condition of mere slaves, but they patiently submitted, and everything went on peaceably for 2 years. About that time, Williams, one of the seamen, having the misfortune to lose his wife, forcibly took the wife of one of the Otaheitans, which, together with their continued ill usage, so exasperated the latter that they formed a plan for murdering the whole of their oppressors. The plot, however, was discovered and revealed by the Englishmen's wives, and 2 of the Otaheitans were put to death. But the surviving natives soon afterwards matured a more successful conspiracy, and in one day murdered 5 of the Englishmen, including Christian. Adams and Young were spared at the intercession of their wives, and the remaining 2, McCoy and Quintal, 2 desperate ruffians, escaped to the mountains, whence, however, they soon rejoined their companions. But the further career of these 2 villains was short. McCoy, having been bred up in a Scottish distillery, succeeded in extracting a bottle of ardent spirits from the tea-root, from which time he and Quintal were never sober, until the former became delirious and committed suicide by jumping over a cliff. Quintal, being likewise almost insane with drinking, made repeated attempts to murder Adams and Young, until they were absolutely compelled, for their own safety, to put him to death, which they did by felling him with a hatchet. Adams and Young were at length the only surviving males who had landed on the island, and being both of a serious turn of mind, and having time for reflection and repentance, they became extremely devout. Having saved a Bible and prayer book from the Bounty, They now performed family worship morning and evening, and addressed themselves to training up their own children and those of their unfortunate companions in piety and virtue. Young, however, was soon carried off by an asthmatic complaint, and Adams was thus left to continue his pious labors alone. At the time Captains Staines and Pippin visited the island, this interesting little colony consisted of about 46 persons, mostly grown-up young people, all living in harmony and happiness together, and not only professing, but fully understanding and practicing the precepts and principles of the Christian religion. Adams had instituted the ceremony of marriage, and he assured his visitors that not one instance of debauchery and immoral conduct had occurred amongst them. The visitors, having supplied these interesting people with some tools, kettles, and other articles, took their leave. The account which they transmitted home of this newly discovered colony was, strange to say, as little attended to by government as that of Captain Folger, and nothing more was heard of Adams and his family for nearly 12 years, when in 1825 Captain Beechey, in the Blossom, bound on a voyage of discovery to Bering Strait, touched at Pitcairn's Island. On the approach of the Blossom, a boat came off under all sail towards the ship, containing old Adams and 10 of the young men of the island. After requesting and obtaining leave to come on board, the young men sprang up the side and shook every officer cordially by the hand. Adams, who was grown very corpulent, followed more leisurely. He was dressed in a sailor suit and trousers, with a low-crowned hat, which he held in his hand in sailor fashion, while he smoothed down his bald forehead when addressed by the officers of the Blossom. The little colony had now increased to about 66, including an English sailor of the name of John Buffett, who, at his own earnest desire, had been left by a whaler. In this man the society luckily found an able and willing schoolmaster. He instructed the children in reading, writing, and arithmetic, and devoutly cooperated with old Adams in affording religious instruction to the community. The officers of the Blossom went ashore, and were entertained with a sumptuous repast at young Christian's, the table being spread with plates, knives, and forks. Buffett said grace in an emphatic manner, and so strict were they in this respect that it was not deemed proper to touch a morsel of bread without saying grace both before and after it. The officers slept in the house all night, their bed-clothing and sheets consisting of the native cloth made of the native mulberry tree. The only interruption to their repose was the melody of the evening hymn, which was chanted together by the whole family after the lights were put out, and they were awakened at early dawn by the same devotional ceremony. On Sabbath the utmost decorum was attended to, and the day was passed in regular religious observances. In consequence of a representation made by Captain Beechey, the British government sent out Captain Waldegrave in 1830 in the Seringapatam with a supply of sailors' blue jackets and trousers, flannels, stockings, and shoes, women's dresses, spades, mattocks, shovels, pickaxes, trowels, rakes, etc. He found their community increased to about 79, all exhibiting the same unsophisticated and amiable characteristics as we have before described. 2 other Englishmen had settled amongst them, one of them called Nobbs, a low-bred, illiterate man, a self-constituted missionary who was endeavoring to supersede Buffett in his office of religious instructor. The patriarch, Adams, it was found, had died in March of 1829, aged 65. While on his deathbed he had called the heads of families together and urged upon them to elect a chief, which, however, they had not yet done, but the greatest harmony still prevailed amongst them, notwithstanding Nobb's exertions to form a party of his own. Captain Waldegrave thought that the island, which is about 4 miles square, might be able to support 1,000 persons, upon reaching which number they would naturally emigrate to other islands. Such is the account of this most singular colony, originating in crime and bloodshed. Of all the repentant criminals on record, the most interesting perhaps is John Adams, nor do we know where to find a more beautiful example of the value of early instruction than in the history of this man, who, having run the full career of nearly all kinds of vice, was checked by an interval of leisurely reflection, and the sense of new duties awakened by the power of natural affections. End of Story 1, Part 2.